to have musical talent. For our scripture reading, please turn with me to Exodus 3, 5, and 6. That's Exodus 3, 5, and 6. Then he said, "Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said also, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Kenny, your time.
I feel so relieved because we've all received a blessing already, so regardless of what I have to say, it's bound to be good because we've already been blessed. And I was thinking about the property here, and I can remember I was here with the groundbreaking and so on, and in fact, Ron and I did a number, and I remember that, can't remember his name. Who was the pastor then? I can picture him, but I can't remember the name. Young man. Kathy? Yeah, I know it had gold in it. Yeah. But, and had prayer and bless, and so I wonder if this property is still blessed. And perish the thought, what if the church burned down? What if it went, would this ground still be blessed? And so I was contemplating this holy ground deal, you know. And you go a lot of different directions from Genesis chapter 3 there. And the holiness in the church, all kinds of things. And then I was up at one of my hideaway property. And way back in homesteading days, that 1 acre out in the middle of the nowhere, really, was dedicated to an Adventist church. Way back, even before Old Zion, before I was born, you know. And I ended up with that property. And so I was up there, well, I've had it for years. And I've tried various means to drill a well up there. And some of them are rather hilarious. The first one I remember was like a one-man post hole digger, you know. And I'd had to climb up on a ladder because the drill stem was about 5 feet long. So you stand up there and hold this thing, and then I'm off the grid, and so I've dug a pond there and water in it, and I have a gas motor to recycle the water to run down through the drill stem. And I hit a rock, and the clutch was supposed to release, but it didn't. And so it knocked out my hand and knocked me off the ladder, but it kept running. And in running, it is winding up and pulling the other gas motor out of the pond. It was really quite hilarious. And I hate to hasten to the point and tell you, I tried at various means for about 15 or 20 years, and I gave up about 2 years ago. I had graduated to where a fine drill outfit on a trailer, I could pull it behind my little Ford Explorer, but I kept hitting rocks. But at any rate, I did get down about almost as deep as the well, as the pit I had dug from my outhouse. I got down almost that far. And in the process, I bought some bentonite. And in fact, Ray Koberstein had a hand in that, by the way, told me where I could get this bentonite. And as soon as I mentioned bentonite, I practiced this sermon at the Davenport people I go regularly. And as soon as I said bentonite, Mark Scheifler started laughing. He way ahead of the story. But anyway, when I gave up, I had these bags of bentonite, and it looked to me just like gravel, kind of. And I thought that would be really good for my paths in and out of my luxurious motorhome up there and so on. And so I spread that out there, and some of you are giggling already. Maybe you knew more about bentonite than I did at the time. And then it rained, And one day I was walking around up there, and I was deciding, I didn't realize I was this tall. Well, that stuff had stuck to my feet, to my boots, and then more stuck to that. And I was walking around, this is a slight exaggeration, but about 5 or 6 inches of that stuff on so I was taller than I was wont to be. And then I got thing on this wise, and so I spent a lot of time, and so I had the generator going out there, and then another old motorhome, a bus as my tool shed. So in the process, being out there in the wilderness all by myself, I had to walk around a lot. And I had spread that stuff all over. So then the rain comes, and another month or so, I'm up there, and that's what had happened to the bentonite. And so then I spent quite a bit of time nailing a special board on the entryway to my luxurious motorhome where I could scrape my feet off of this mud, because even me, I've been an old cowboy, but I don't want all that stuff in my motorhome. And so I spent all this time, and I'm thinking, well, this is probably holy ground. This is holy mud. I shouldn't be scraping it off, So I was terribly confused about the whole situation. And then, through the years in my preaching appointments, I have an invitation to go and speak at different churches. And then nice people many times will have me home for lunch, in the afternoon, and sometimes the whole weekend if it's a long ways away. But at any rate, some of the place where I go is very nice, and you're supposed to take your shoes off. But a lot of people don't realize I don't wear shoes, I wear boots. I have all my life. My feet are conformed to boots, I guess, the cowboy-type boots. I have some kind of dude boots anyway. But at any rate, one in particular, it was at Bonners Ferry, and I don't remember whose place it was, but it was very nice. And there was a very tactful sign, and you may enter to this lovely home, about removing your shoes, So I sat down there. There was a chair conveniently, and I sat down and finally got my boots on. It wasn't easy. And then later on in the afternoon, when it was time to go home, I had to put my boots back on. And I had worn the wrong pair that day. I have boot hooks, and I pull them on there fairly easy, but to get them back on again without the boot hooks. And I struggled to get my boots back on. And there were other people there besides me and the host and hostess, of course. They began to notice Pastor Kenny trying to get his shoes on, and it was becoming more entertaining than I wished that it would be. And finally, the upshot was I gave up. I walked out my car, one boot on and the other boot under my arm. I remember that too well. What's this business about taking your shoes off? Holy ground. Holy ground. And here we are in this sacred spot. And, the troubles of the world right now have a lot to do with Israel, and the land that was given to them. And we say it's holy ground. But is it? Is it? So like I say, I go a lot of directions over that theme. And that brings up another thought in this same vein, as it were. And perhaps here it doesn't fit quite as well as the Davenport. How many have been to the Davenport church? A few of you have. I think we narrow it down. How many have been to the Fruitland church? I see one hand up. Kathy? Your hubby might have drilled the well up there, or I think it had to do, I'm not sure. But at any rate, it's the oldest Seventh-day Adventist church in the state of Washington, with this exception. I mean, that's in the original building. So that little old building, I'm guessing, I should measure it, but it's probably about 40 feet long, maybe, something like that, maybe 50 feet. And probably 20, well, the whole the whole building would fit right in here, I think, in the room left over. But at any rate, and then they have it's had a sign out there by 1896. They've had a sign out there. And I think I'm involved about the second or third times that it has been closed and now trying to get open again, we're trying to get things going again. It's going pretty good. But the only reason I mentioned it was then the Sabbath keepers, the few of them were meeting in the Presbyterian church at Hunter's. And that church, it's old, but it's impressive. It has a steeple, and it still has the bell on it and rope hanging down. I guess they ring the bell once in a while. But it's, I don't know if it's registered in the, what do we call it, the antique type deal or not, but it should be. It's in good shape. And then the little Fruitland church, so humble. And right now it needs painting. And there's a sign out front telling about the Pioneer Adventist Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, if somebody's driving by and they drive by the Hunter's Church, the beautiful classic old church, and then they drive by the little Fruitland Church, which one do you think would be most impressive? And then I will venture out into, I don't want an answer, I don't think. But it's the congregation, really, isn't it? The congregation that really counts. So which worship building is the holiest? Like I say, only God can answer that, I think. Only God can answer that. So like I say, how do we treat each other? How do we treat this holy little building? And that reminds me, and some of you old-timers have probably heard this story a zillion times, because it's been my privilege to speak at Countryside. Not a lot lately, but years past quite a bit. So I tell all these true stories. Not just stories happening in my life. And I wasn't really brought up Adventist, brought up in a strange background. Both my parents had been Adventists, but for various reasons, before I was ever born, things changed. And so I can remember once, I was probably about 4 years old, 4 or 5, and I don't know how Dad allowed, maybe it wasn't better then, I don't know. But Mom let me go to a vacation Bible school. And I can kind of remember that. But then years go by and we live out in the wilderness and couldn't have gone to church if we did wanted to and so on. And skipping over that, some good and some terribly bad. But at any rate, and then we got at the little 8th grade little had only went to 8th grade. School way up there in the wilderness where I was raised. We went through a lot of teachers. And I told people I don't know why, because the teachers had it so soft. You know, the well was only about 100 yards from the school, and there was a rope on a bucket, and they could pull the water up, you know, and there was a wood pile up there. They could cut wood from themselves, but we furnished the wood. They could chop it themselves. And there was kerosene lamps there, and so the teachers had it really soft, you know. But we went, besides that, dealing with all those cowboy kids, mostly boys. For some reason, we went through a lot of teachers. And then we got a nice little teacher. She was probably about 4 foot 5 or 6. And I was little for my age. And by the way I was only a baby when I was born. Some of the people might believe that. But at any rate, this lady was really nice. And she was a Seventh-day Adventist, which is very unusual because it was a public school and so on. But it wasn't, I guess looking back, it wasn't, I suppose if a teacher was assigned to that school, they might not have been very happy. I don't know how it worked, you know. But at any rate, this little teacher, her name was Ethel Eden. And she was so nice that even the wickedest kids couldn't think of anything bad to go tell her folks about Mrs. Eden. The only thing bad was that she was a Christian, a Seventh-day Adventist, and Christians didn't go over really well over there, but she went over really well. But that's another story, a lot of stories behind that one. But at any rate, that was about 20 miles out in the wilderness, and now it's not very far with good cars, but back then it was a long ways. And she and her husband had a home in Tonasket down. That's like the big city, you know, when you're a kid. And so she worked out this deal. Once in a while, she'd go home to the town place. Her husband would come, his old Model A Ford, and they'd go down there, and she would invite different kids to go with her and spend the weekend. And that was like going to the World's Fair or something. That was really tremendous. And I thought my dad wouldn't let me go. But he did let me go because of another story that I'm skipping about. It involves safety pin and honesty and so on. But at any rate, we went to the church in Tonasket. And I was about probably 8 or 9. And even though I wasn't brought up in a church, obviously, my mom said that a church was God's house. And this, looking back, this is kind of interesting, kind of strange to me. Even though he lived in a shack, which I didn't know was a shack, I didn't realize it was a shack. But my mom had some culture. And you don't come in the house and you take your hat off. And you certainly don't sit down and eat with your hat on. So then we go to church. I go to church. And Miss Eden, all the kids, you kids, are sitting up near the front like you were for the story hour. And she sent me up there, and we're a little late, and I walking down the aisle, and I was kind of looking, and people were smiling at me, and I thought, that's a friendly group. And some were almost laughing, and I thought, wow, that's really the friendly group, right in God's house. And I sat down just in front of a bunch of those kids, because I had heard of one or two of them, but I didn't know them at all. And I felt awestruck that I'm in God's house. And a man kneeled down and prayed. And it was like he was talking to God, like God was right there. And I thought, since we're in God's house, that fits, and maybe I could see God. But I was scared to peek even to I kept my eyes tight and shut, but I wanted to open them because maybe I could see God. But I was scared to, because if God saw me looking at him, he might zap me dead. And then while that nice man was talking to God, those kids were starting to whisper. And one little girl was trying to keep from laughing, you know. And I thought, wow, I wish God would zap her. Who was most reverent in God's house? Well, that's not quite the end of the story. While I was sitting there, involved in the whole deal, and I had hard to have words to express how I felt in God's house. Somebody touched me on the shoulder. I turned around, one of the kids handed me a little note that my teacher, Mrs. Eden, had sent from the back. And I opened it up. I couldn't read really good, but I read good enough to see what it said. It said, "Kenny, take your hat off." And it wasn't an ordinary hat. It was a winter. It wasn't a special. I prized that hat. It wasn't a regular cowboy hat like you usually wore. This is a winter hat. It had floppers that come down over your ears, and there was wool in there. And there had a deal you pull down over your forehead with wool on it. And you could buckle it under your chin. And I looked funny. Now, I knew all the people were grinning at me and someone laughing because I looked so funny. And I thought, oh, it's a wonder God didn't zap me. I wouldn't even my mom would make me take that hat off in the house, and here I worn it in God's house. Who was most reverent? Little Kenny, sitting there raptured in God's house. Holy ground. Now my sermon says that God has a dilemma. And I'm not sure that's the right word. Does a dilemma indicates something that is a real problem and you can't solve it? Or if you can, it takes a long time, a lot of study and so on. Well, now we know, I know, and I believe it, that God created his world in 6 days. And it's really nice. And it's not as nice now as it was when he first created it. We as Adventists understand that. Sin has done a dirty job on the world too, not just its people. Six days to create the world. Turn to John chapter 14. You think I'm changing the subject, but I'm not. John chapter 14, and probably most of us wouldn't have to turn it. But I want to read the first 3 verses, at least. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, because where you are, I want to be. Mansions. Yeah. Take your shoes off. What kind of mansions does God have? So what I'm saying, and you're reading between the lines, we're to go in those mansions. And I suspect that there'll be people there who never wore any shoes in all their life. How are they going to take their shoes off? It isn't the shoes that count, it's the one who made the place holy. It's the respect or non-respect we have for the builder of the mansions. So now the dilemma. What's God going to do about these fallen people that he plans to take home with him, to live with him forever? And they have not only dirty shoes, but dirty people from a dirty world. And God only took 6 days, as we understand, to build this beautiful world. But how many centuries have we lived since then? And I do believe that God is really anxious to take us home. Because Hebrews says that for the joy that's set before him, he endured the cross, ignored the shame, ignored the insult, ignored the whole thing, when he could easily have got out of it. Except for one thing, us. Dilemma. Yeah, couldn't he just zap us? Like I was wishing he'd zap that little girl who was whispering during the prayer. Or the wonder went through at that kid is wonder God didn't zap me for wearing my hat in his house. All these centuries. And if we're anxious to inhabit those mansions, wouldn't you suppose that Jesus is at least as anxious and probably far more so? His dilemma. He gave us free choice. It's up to us. And when I first dedicated myself to the Lord, when I was riding my horse, when I was about 16 or 17 years old up in the wilderness, and promised God that I wanted to be his man, I never dreamed I would have the privilege of living as long as I've lived and still do the things that I do at 94 years of age. But the reason I tell you that is that early on, when I first began to get acquainted with Christians, and especially Seventh Adventist Christians, and especially if I would see a preacher as old as I am, I'd think, wow, that person is so holy, it's a wonder that they haven't been secretly wrapped off to heaven by now. But to my distress, I've found out it ain't necessarily so. In fact, the longer I live, the more I realize how much I lack yet. I think of the young man in the scripture that came to Jesus and said, "What lack I yet? 94 years old, and I have not been secretly raptured. Here I stand with all you good people." And I've come to an interesting conclusion. I wonder who the youngest kid is here. Doesn't make a lot of difference, I guess, but I sure like a church that has a lot of boys and girls, which you do here. So just suppose that whoever the youngest kid is here, old enough to understand what I'm talking about, if they love Jesus and love their parents and they live up to what they know is right, yeah, they probably don't know as much about the Bible as I do and as we older people do. But what about it, boys and girls? What if you loved Jesus enough that you would be willing to actually die for him? And I love Jesus enough to actually die for him, which would be the greatest sacrifice. I'm way beyond my warranty anyway. 30 years before my warranty. I have no trade-in value either. Car terms. But Jesus knows our hearts, doesn't he? So, what's he going to do about it? Well, this is only one little thing. But let's turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 10. Hebrews, chapter 10. It occurs to me I paid no attention to my notes. Look at it. This could have been a long sermon. Hebrews chapter 10. I think for this I better put on my old geezer glasses. Well, by the way, I enjoyed your lesson about teeth. And I got all my, how do I put this? I don't have false teeth. And yet I do, because I've got several implants, and I got a lot of empty spaces. And I've been waiting for the teeth to go in the empty spot, and it doesn't seem to be working in my vintage. And when I go and have my teeth cleaned, every 6 months, and we've been faithful about that, I tell her I need a discount because I don't have as many teeth as I used to. They keep falling out. And she laughs, but she doesn't give me a discount anyway. But anyway, where were we going with that? I have no idea. Hebrews chapter 10. Where shall we start? Let's start at verse 21 of Hebrews chapter 10. And having an high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from evil conscience. Having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as ye see the day approaching. What day? The day when Jesus will return. And then it goes on. I got it underlined carefully. First one word in red, and that's blue, red, blue, because that gives me a special attention. For if we sin willfully after that we have received the knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sin. Assemble ourselves together. And so I said, what's God going to do? We are experiencing today one of the things that we are to do. We have assembled together in this holy church, this house of God, in keeping with God's request to make and shape and mold us into the kind of people that will be welcomed. Tried small word. Welcomed into his mansions. Wow. Ephesians chapter 5. Let's start at verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church. I went to see Eleanor, my wife of 74 years. On Tuesday was our wedding anniversary. 74 years of marriage. Of course, I was only 5 years old when we were married. No, I was 19, as I recall. But at any rate, she's over off Indian Trail Road, off of Barnes Road up there at a small adult family home. She can't really talk anymore. She's lost about that ability after strokes and age. But she tries. And I know what she was saying, trying to say. She didn't realize it's our wedding anniversary. I usually go on Thursday, but I went twice this time. I went Tuesday, our wedding anniversary. She holds my hand really tight. And she puts my hand up and kisses it. And she tries to say it, I love you. I love you. But link that with what we come to as we go on. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. And here's the punchline. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church, without spot and without blemish, to go into God's mansion. And I hope this is all right to say. I don't care about the mansion. The King James says mansion, there are other things, dwelling places and other things. It wouldn't take much of a mansion to impress me. I mentioned my lovely homes up at my hideaway property. One old ugly commercial bus because the motorhome was so ugly, even my wife didn't want on the road, it was up there. And then a nice old motorhome with a cover over it. Those are simple, but they're plenty good. It wouldn't take much to impress me. What impresses me is being where Jesus is. I can hardly wait. And so we are going through the process of, by God's grace, doing that which he cannot force us to do, but love will cause us to want to do, to become the kinds of people, be comfortable in his presence forever. Amen. Without spot, without blemish. Take your shoes off, brothers and sisters. Take your shoes off.